Alright, so let's get into actually using the search and reporting features within Splunk. And to do that, well, we'll need to actually have some events to search through, right? And to be honest, the best way to teach Splunk, or any SIM for that matter, is to do so practically with as many examples as possible. And so we're going to take a look at a number of different data sets to learn how to search and filter and perform analysis to support our investigations. And fortunately, we have many different ways to get events inside of Splunk. And as I mentioned earlier, well, we can upload events or log files from their individual log sources manually, or we can forward events directly into Splunk using the forwarding agents. And so let's start off with a very basic example so we can get the hang of the interface and the look and feel for what it's like to work with events in Splunk. And the easiest way I can think of demonstrating something like this is to create our own very basic CSV log file and then import it into Splunk. And so I'm just going to open up the terminal here. And then I'm just going to navigate into the SIM directory to keep things organized. And now I'm going to open up Nano. Well, you could use any text editor of your choice like Sublime Text or even Notepad, but I'm just going to use Nano for its simplicity. And I'm just going to call our file sample.csv. And I want to start out our CSV file by defining our different columns. And once the files ran through Splunk and ingested, well, the data within our file will be parsed and normalized. And each of the columns that we define here will be turned into actual data fields that we can search and filter through, or generate statistics on. And so for this example, let's say we have an authentication log file from a very basic program that logs anytime a user attempts to log into the application. And so in terms of columns, we might want to capture things like the timestamp. And we can separate this column with a comma. And then we might want to capture the username, or the event type. So I can just call that event_type. We might want to capture the source IP address of the connection. And we might want the actual authentication status, so whether it failed or succeeded. Alright, and so we have our columns defined here. And I just wanted to be verbose and walk through it manually. However, to make things quicker, what we can do here is just delete this line that we just wrote. I'm sorry, but if you're using Nano, you can just press Ctrl and K at the same time, and it will delete the current line that you have highlighted. And then in the section below this video, you'll find the contents that we can copy and paste into our log file to populate it with some sample events. And so I have mine on my clipboard, and I'm just going to press Ctrl, Shift, and V to paste that in. Alright, so that's looking good. We have some sample log events that we can now load into Splunk. And so I'm just going to save this with Ctrl and X, and then press the Y key. And then just hit Enter to save it. Alright, so once that's saved, let's import our newly created log file into Splunk. And so again, to do that, to get here, we can either go from the dashboard, and we can either just click on this Add Data button here under the Quick Links, or we can go under Settings, and then just click Add Data from right here. And so either way will work. And so once we're on the Add Data page, you'll see at the very top here, we have a number of different options for apps and add-on connectors. And so if I just click on Cloud Computing, for example, there are a number of different Splunk apps available to us here that provide pre-built configurations and integrations for specific data sources, right? So we can ingest CloudFront logs from AWS or configuration data. And if we go under Operating System, well, this gives us an easy predefined way to ingest Windows event logs. However, we do have the following options at the bottom here. So we can manually upload files, right? And this is what we're going to do. And this is useful for one-time or occasional data imports for files like CSVs or JSONs or different individual log files. And so it's useful if we just want to test something out like we're doing now. And next we have the monitor section here. And so we can do things like file and directory monitoring. And so we can point Splunk to specific local files on the system. And so this can be really useful for getting logs into our search head itself. Or we can do things with TCP and different network ports, right? So Splunk can listen in on different network ports for incoming data, and through that we can collect logs from our different network devices or security appliances, or any system that can just send its data over the network. And so again, we can ingest logs through TCP or UDP listeners, or HTTP or HTTPS, and even through various scripts and APIs. And if you recall from before, we touched on this as an alternative option to get events into Splunk or any SIM without using an installed agent. And lastly, speaking of agents, well, we have this third forward option right here. And so we have what are known in Splunk as forwarders, which can sit on our endpoints as actual binaries or executables and forward out any telemetry or log sources that we specify. And with Splunk, we have two different types. And so we have the universal forwarder, which is Splunk's sort of lightweight forwarder that we can install on different machines to send data back to the Splunk instance. And so this is the common choice when we're thinking about deploying agents across our systems. But Splunk also offers something called the heavy forwarder, which is for more complex processing needs. And so the heavy forwarder can, again, sit on the endpoints, but it can actually pre-process data before forwarding it to the indexer, and provide different capabilities like filtering and routing. And so it's not as lightweight as the universal forwarder, but it can be really useful in certain situations. And so in our case, let's select upload here, since we obviously want to test out and upload our newly created CSV file. And from here, it's just as simple as selecting our file from our Explorer window. And so I'm just going to navigate to the sim folder and pick out my sample.csv file. And once it's been uploaded, as you can see here, well, we can just hit next. And since we saved it as a CSV, well, you can see that Splunk was automatically able to parse out the different fields and values using the comma-separated delimiters. And so on this page, we can get a preview of how Splunk is processing our data before we send it off for indexing. And so we can look through to make sure that the data looks right, and the different columns and fields are in order, and the timestamps look correct. And we can see over on the left here that the source type was in fact automatically detected as CSV. And we could open up some more advanced settings here, like actually specifying the field delimiters or the quote characters, which in theory we could change and mess around with if, for example, we were running into any import errors. But in this case, everything looks fine to me, so I'm just going to hit next. And so from here, we can see the various input and index settings for our upload. And so we need to first specify the host field value, which is used by Splunk during indexing. And as best practice, the host value should be the name of the machine or system that generated the event. And so I'm just going to leave this as is. And as we scroll down under index here, and this is where we can select the specific index where we want to store the incoming events into. And again, indexes in Splunk are like special storage places or buckets where data is organized and stored for more efficient searching and retrieval. And these storage places are on a part of Splunk known as the indexer. And so when Splunk receives new raw data, it undergoes a process where it's transformed into searchable events. And these events are then stored within the index. And so Splunk at the top level is going to store a number of individual databases or indexes. And each of these indexes stores specific log sources or groups of log sources together in the form of events. For example, if we had a number of event sources or log sources from various networking devices like firewalls or web application firewalls or routers, well, we might put that into a bucket or an index for networking events, since we'll have similar fields in our events like source and destination IP, since most of these events will follow that structure of the TCP/IP model. And so since we're dealing with some test or sandbox data, let's just create a sample index. And so I'm just going to click on create a new index here. And for the title, I'm just going to call it sample_index. And I'm going to leave everything else as default and then just hit save. All right. And so lastly, we can just click on review here to make sure everything lines up and is good to go. And finally, we can click on submit to upload our log source and send it off to the indexer. And so now you can see that the log file was uploaded successfully. And so with that, let's click on the apps button in the Splunk bar, and then click on search and reporting to be taken to that search and reporting app. And so back on our search dashboard here, well, you can see there's not much difference, right? However, what we can do now is modify our search criteria to pull back all of the events for that index. And so again, this is not best practice, but remember, for the sake of this example, let's set the time range selector here to all time so we can aggregate all of the events in the system. Then in the search bar here, let's specifically tell Splunk to pull back only events from our sample_index that we created. And so to do this, I'm just going to type in the index field and set that to equal. And you can see as we start to type, Splunk is really helpful and starts to present useful suggestions like matching terms or contextual matches or assistance with the search syntax in general. And so to specify our index, I'm just going to wrap it in double quotes here. And if you recall, we named it sample_index. And I can type this out, or I can just click this suggestion right here. And so with that ready to go, I can click on this green search button, or just hit the enter key. And once we run the search, well, it will be sent to the search head where it runs as a new search job. And once complete, Well, we're going to pull back all 12 events from our log. And so now we're starting to get a lot more information as this new search result page opens up. And so let's take a look at some of the new options in this interface. And so first, at the top of our new search, you'll see this handy Save As button here. And this allows us to save out our actual search job into a knowledge object, like reports or alerts, or send them to a dashboard. And so obviously this option can be super useful if we want to use our current search parameters and turn it into, say, a report that runs every so often. Or if we wanted to turn our criteria or search conditions into an alert. And so anytime we had an event that matches this criteria, well, we can generate an alert to be notified of. We can also use the results of this search and move them into a new or existing dashboard. And say if we wanted to pull back this table of events with specific fields or columns extracted, or if we wanted to look at any statistics to look at percentages of successful or failed logins, or create any charts or graphs to correlate any of this data, well, this is a quick and handy option for us to get to that functionality. And below, to the left here, you can see we have these search results tabs. And by default here, you'll see that the events tab is selected, and we can get a count of the total number of events returned, or the events that matched our search criteria, in this case 12. And this is the tab that we'll typically see when we run a search, as it lists out the returned events, as well as any of the fields that were extracted from them. And so again, for a simple search like this, like the one we did here, well, this is the default tab that we'll be presented with. However, we can also navigate to the Patterns tab as well. And in this tab, well, as the name suggests, it allows us to see different patterns within our data or returned events. However, with such a small sample size of only 12 events returned, we're not going to be able to take advantage of this section yet. Typically, Splunk wants a sample size of at least 5,000 or more. But just to demonstrate, I can turn up the sensitivity here of the pattern size to as large as possible. And when we do that, well, we can see a single pattern that returned. And if we click on this, we can see the events that it matched to. And so obviously not super useful in this case, but this kind of pattern matching or analysis can be really useful for searches that return a diverse range of events, because it quickly shows us the most common types of events in our results. And so if we were running a search that generates any statistics or visuals through different transformation commands, which we'll get into when we start playing around with SPL, well, they'll either be displayed in the statistics or the visualization tabs. And so I'm just going to head back to the events tab. And so above this section, well, we can see the total number of events that were returned. And again, we can see some timeline information as well, and a section for event sampling. And so by default, a Splunk search retrieves all of the events, right, as expected. However, in some situations, we might want to retrieve a sample set of events instead of retrieving the entire set. And so this can be useful in certain cases where we just want to run a test, or just a quick search to ensure that the correct events are being returned. Or if we just want to quickly determine the characteristics or the fields that are extracted from a large dataset without processing every event, which can be really timely. And the different sampling ratios that you can see here is just the likelihood of any event being included in the sample. And so, for example, if the sample ratio value is 100, well, each event has a 1 in 100 chance of being included in the results set. And just to the right of this, we have some search action buttons. And so we can see this job option here. And so again, when you run a search in Splunk, it's treated as a search job. And so we can do things like edit the actual job settings. And so we can change the read permissions for this search job or this result. We can also generate a unique URL for this job as well, and we can use that URL to share with other colleagues, or add a bookmark for ourselves. We can inspect the job, and so this can show us information and metrics about the actual search job that was performed. Or we can delete the job as well. And if we had a long search job that was still running, well, we would have the option here that's not grayed out, to send that actual search job into the background to free up our console so we can work on other things, or run other searches in the meantime. And you can see some additional icons here as well. And so again, if a search job was currently running, we'd have the option to pause it or stop it completely. Here we have the option to share our search job, and so this will generate a link to share with others, or allow us to bookmark it for our own use. We also have the option here to print out the results, and also export them or download them as a file. And so we can export this out to a CSV, or download the raw events, or download them in XML or JSON format as well. Lastly, within this menu, we have the option to select various search modes. And so you can see the default mode here that's selected is called Smart Mode. And so let's go through these in order. And so Fast Mode here speeds up the actual search by cutting down on the actual event information that the search returns. And so again, it can be quicker, but we can lose out on some fields if they're not default fields, or if they're not necessary to fulfill our search query. At the bottom, we have verbose mode, and this returns as much event information and fields as possible. And in the middle here, again, we have smart mode, or the default, which automatically toggles the search behavior between fast and verbose, depending on the type of search that we're currently running. And so below all this information, we can see this long graph running across the middle of our screen with different green bars. And this is the event timeline, and is one of those common things that you're going to see across many different SIEM solutions. And so this event timeline is just a visual representation of the events that we've returned, segmented over time. And so the segments you see here are dynamically decided depending on the time range that we select. And so in our case, our specific CSV listed out 12 different log events occurring every 5 minutes from each other, which is why in this case, the time range for this timeline dynamically segmented itself to have a single event specified by these bars every 5 minutes, spanning from the first event in the list all the way to the last, or the most recent. And by clicking and dragging across the timeline, well, we can select a specific time range in the event timeline to investigate. And so in doing so, the event list below will automatically update to just show, in this case, the 2 events that we selected. And we can also use the zoom out and zoom to selection options here to specifically narrow down or broaden our scope as needed. And so I'm just going to change our time range back to all time, which is under presets. And so as mentioned, all of the events containing our search criteria that we ran in our search are listed out under this events list here. And any of the fields that were extracted from these events shows up in the left here on this field sidebar. And if we search for any keywords or phrases within our search, well, Splunk will highlight these matches for us directly under the events column. For example, I'm jumping ahead a bit, but I can do a quick search for the word failed, just by typing it in like that. And in doing this, well, this time you can see we only returned 4 events that match the word failed, and you can see that the keyword here is in fact highlighted. It's also important to take a look at the time column here, and notice that the events are returned in reverse chronological order, showing the newest events first. And now regarding time, Splunk does in fact normalize our time within our index to a consistent format, but the timestamp we see in these events is based on the time zone set in our user account. And this is another one of those things or quirks that's super common across multiple SIEM solutions. And so if we click on Administrator up in the Splunk bar, and then click on Preferences, well, we can quickly change our time zone to whatever makes sense. And so typically as best practice, we want to ensure that all systems that are sending logs to Splunk are synchronized to the same time source. And typically this is done through something like NTP or the Network Time Protocol. And importantly, we want to use UTC, or the Coordinated Universal Time, as the standard time zone for all servers and devices. And this just avoids confusion with daylight savings and different time zones. And then on Splunk, or the search head side, an individual analyst can set their preferred time zone according to their location or their team's operating zone, while keeping the underlying data in UTC. And so moving on, across each returned event, well, you'll see different fields. And currently we have the default selected fields of host and source type, which we can also see matched over here on the left under the selected fields section. We can also use our cursor to hover over any interesting keywords or strings within the returned events, which will give us some additional options if we were to click on a piece of text. And so, for example, by highlighting on the username of M. Johnson and clicking on it, well, we now have options to add this as a keyword to our search, or to explicitly exclude this keyword from our search, or to create a brand new search with just this keyword. And we can also click on any of these icons here to run any of these options in a new tab while we keep our existing search open. And so if I select exclude from search here, well, you can see that our search query actually changed, and we now only have 3 results returned, as we excluded the single event here that was containing the phrase or the keyword M. Johnson. Now, we're only getting 2 main columns returned by default, right? We have the time up at the top here, and then this event column, which is more or less just referring to the raw data that has been ingested into Splunk. Well, if we just leave it like this, we're not even scratching the surface of what Splunk can do for us. And so if we select the arrow next to an event, or this info button here, well, we can actually open it up and then see all of the extracted fields from each event. And so there we go, right? We can see that as Splunk parsed through and indexed our log file, it was able to extract out these columns, like the authentication status, or the event type, the source IP address, or the username, along with the corresponding values for each of these events. And so this is how we can dive into the details of events within Splunk, especially if we have a super long event record like a Windows event log or a sysmon log. And if we click on any of these values, well, we're going to get the same options here, of being able to add these key value pairs to our existing search, or to a new search, or just exclude any events that match it entirely. And so if I click on Add to Search here, well, we can see how our actual search query changed once again. And so while we're filtering out M. Johnson, we're also pulling back events where the authentication status equals failed. And so I'll just clear this out once again. And so lastly, as I mentioned quite a bit before, on the left here, we have the fields sidebar. And this is a very important section in our search window that helps us refine and analyze our search results by providing a detailed view and more control over the fields present in our data. It also gives us a really good general overview about the types of fields that have been extracted from the current list of results that we returned. And so at the top here, again, we have the selected fields section. And these are fields that we choose to display in our search results table, right? So we can see host and source type. And these fields are explicitly chosen by us, or the search query itself as part of the results. And so for example, I can open up any one of these events and just check off whatever I want, right? So for example, if I check off source_IP here, and then close out the event, well, now we have source IP as one of our selected fields, and we can see it under the selected fields section. And so I'm just going to uncheck that now. And so selected fields are typically the ones that are most relevant to our current search or analysis needs. And under this, we have interesting fields. And these are fields that Splunk identifies as potentially useful or interesting based on the data that we've returned in our search. And so these fields are not explicitly stated by us, but they're instead highlighted by Splunk's field discovery process. And as the typical criteria, the interesting fields will be fields that appear in at least 20% of the events returned. And so obviously this can be super useful when it comes to trying to make meaningful sense of a large data set, or an index that we haven't interacted with before. And so we can quickly come to terms with things like what are the important fields here, or what fields keep showing up in the data, and that we might be able to use to narrow down our search and find interesting anomalies or deviations. And by clicking on any of the fields in our list, for example source IP, well, we can open up this field pane here, which gives us a lot of useful information. And so first off, in the top right, well, we can choose right from this pane whether we want a particular field to be selected or not. And so we can just enable this yes or no. We can also get some quick report information as well with these hyperlinks. So we can quickly pull back things like the top values or the rare values. And we can also get a list here of the top values for this field. For example, we can see 4 different counts here of 192.168.1.101. And this makes up 33% of our log file. We can see the second value here of 102 has 2 counts and makes up 16%. And so this can be a very quick way for us to find things like the top talkers, or really the top values for any field, like error messages or user agents or response codes, that kind of thing. And so that was a lot of information once again. And so let's take a quick 5, and in the next lesson we're going to do a deep dive into SPL, or the Search Processing Language, which is the query language we're using here to interact with and extract data from Splunk. And with SPL, we'll get to do so many different things like searching and filtering, transforming and analyzing all of the different data that's stored in our indexes. And so I'll see you in the next lesson.